Alright, hey guys. This is going to be the first complex endgame I'm going to be doing, which means there's many pieces on the board. It's like a late middle game with the queens off the board, and we're going to see how Michael Adams, a 2700, converts this endgame into a same colored bishop's ending. I'm going to show a lot of principles along the way. He's playing a 2200 in this game. I'm going to fast forward through the opening just to get to the transition into the endgame. This part is not so important. White tries to get an advantage by taking the 7th rank there, but it doesn't really help him because even though he does get the 7th rank with the rook, black is able to shut down the rooks with his bishop here. And this is kind of instructive because we immediately think if I've infiltrated, I've got an advantage, but sometimes some files don't really have infiltration points, and this bishop here does a good job of making this play on the file kind of meaningless. And then black will be able to swap off the rooks anyways. So, just if I haven't mentioned, black is Michael Adams. He's gonna outplay white. Okay, so what does white do? He has to save his rook first of all. Okay, so he tries to run away and keep the 7th rank, but black is easily able to swap off the rooks. White cannot maintain his advantage on the 7th rank. And this is the first lesson here: is that often if you want to cash in on an advantage, it's useful to liquidate the right pieces. So if white has both his rooks on the board, he can actually create a lot of problems for black and control a lot of squares. But by swapping off one pair of rooks, black is more able to exploit the weaknesses on white's side because there aren't two rooks controlling everything, right? And when I talk about weaknesses, namely we're talking about these double pawns here, and whereas black's pawn structure is fluid and healthy. We're going to see this factor in a lot later on. Okay, so the question is, how does black go about um, kind of making a winning position out of this? I mean, he's got one trump here. He's fighting against the double pawns. But how do you cash in on this? And here black finds an amazing plan. He goes h6, and then he goes g5. And the idea of this is to open up a file so that his rook can infiltrate, because this bishop alone is not enough pressure on this pawn. But if the rook can somehow get into the game, which we're going to see, that rook is going to create a lot of problems for white, and white is going to be saddled down trying to hold on to his weak pawns. So g5 puts a question to white. What does white do? If he just defends the pawn, then black takes, white, then black takes. Sorry, my internet is going a bit slow. Hopefully this loads sometime soon. What's going on here? Takes. Jeez. Oh, sorry. It's white's turn to move. G5. Yeah, okay. If white plays G3, then black takes. Oh my god, why is it not letting me do this? Anyways, he takes, and then the black rook will come in and infiltrate down the G file. So G3 doesn't really help. And if white takes, then black gets the open H file to work with, and then the rook will come and infiltrate on the 4th rank there. Okay. So what happened in the game? Sorry guys, my internet is messing me up with this video. Okay, so we're in this position. Takes. Okay, that doesn't help. The rook is ready to infiltrate on h4. We get a3. Now here, another useful lesson is prophylaxis. What does white want to do here? He wants to push b4 and get some counterplay on the queen side, okay? So how does black cramp down on white? How does he stop white's counterplay? The move is a5. Jeez, this thing is really messing me up in this video. At least the internet is working now. Okay, here. The move a5 doesn't, it kind of, now if white tries to go with b4, we take. Okay, this internet, damn it. Yeah, we would take, and then take, and then rook here, rook h4, and white will not be able to hold on to all this. It's just these pawns are too weak. Okay. So white kind of needs to keep this pawn here to guard this pawn, which keeps him passive. Anyways, let's keep going here. White plays b3, keep an eye on this pawn. And now rook h4 was played. Now this isn't the only way to continue. Another interesting idea is to play a4 here, with the idea that if white takes, it's only a temporary pawn sacrifice because first of all the rook could come here and grab the pawn, or the rook can come here and snatch this pawn, right? So this, we call this a monkey wrench. You just throw the pawn in there, temporary sacrifice, and then white's pawn structure looks terrible, right? So there were a couple of different ways to continue. He played rook h4, simple, check, the king comes out. And now here, another lesson is that why are double pawns bad? It's because they don't control, one thing is that in this position, they don't control the center very well. So the king is able to occupy this awesome center square. Whereas if you look at white's king cannot access the same squares in the center because black is able to control all the center squares. The king will not be able to infiltrate very easily. Okay, so the black king is excellently placed in the center. h3 was played. Black gets the chance to play f5. His pawns are rolling check, and the king comes behind the pawns. So the king and pawn were able to kind of switch places. Now this is a pretty menacing pawn duo there. Okay, so we get a4 now. Now another thing you will notice is in endgames is that you often cannot hold on to the same advantage throughout the game, unless it's like a very static chronic weakness. So there's something called transformation of advantages. So initially, black had an advantage of the open file, a lot of pressure with his rook, centralized king, whatever, right? Now he's going to kind of exchange this advantage for an advantage of same colored bishops, except that all of white's pawns are on the same color as his bishop. Okay, look at these. All these pawns are in white squares. And what black is going to do in the next few moves is going to put all his pawns on the dark squares. What this does is that white will have no targets to attack, whereas black will be able to scope out all these weak pawns with his bishop. So it'll kind of be an asymmetrical warfare. So we got a4. Yeah, so here he goes, black. Putting all his pawns on the dark squares. Puts another pawn on the dark squares, and you can see the asymmetry here, right? This bishop can attack all these weak pawns. This bishop cannot attack any of black's pawns. So, okay, rook here. Now, this is another transformation of advantages. Why is black letting white trade off his double pawns? Usually you would want your opponent to be stuck with the double pawns. The reason is he's going to transform his advantage after the exchange. The idea now is that c4 is a pretty devastating threat, because whenever this pawn takes on c4, this a pawn will become really weak, right? And not to mention this rook can also now access the whole fourth rank and swing over. So this rook is doing active duty, this rook is doing passive duty. So yeah, we got a transformation of advantages. Okay, a few more moves here. Now this check is important. If black wants to win on the queen side, do something on the queen side there, he wants white's king. Sorry. Okay, this is the position. If black wants to play on the queen side, he wants white's king as far away from the queen side as possible. Okay, so this check just does just that. The king is not able to come closer to the queen side because he would drop the g2 pawn. So the king is forced to go more over to the king side, and then now the rook comes over, and this king is really far from defending these queenside pawns and bishop and everything. Now black has a threat of bishop takes b3. Sorry. Okay, yeah, black has a threat of bishop takes b3, and if the pawn takes, then the rook can take the bishop. All right. So that's why the bishop had to move here, and he went away. Just protecting the bishop with the rook wouldn't have worked because this walks into a pin. So now we get a move like maybe many things black can do. I mean, c4 is always in the cards, right? And then white is stuck in this pin. This pawn will drop off if the b3 pawn captures there, maybe with something like this. So the rook doesn't want to stay on d1, and it can't go to e3 because of the fork, right? So the bishop had to move. Rook comes in, and it's now is targeting these weak pawns, and the only way for white to guard both is rook here. And this is where it becomes clear that black has been setting up this position all along so that even with the rook trade, he has a major advantage here. With this bishop, all these pawns are on the black squares, except this one, he's going to move that forward next turn. And all these pawns are on the white squares, which means black's bishop will have a lot of targets. Let's see how he cashes in. So first, yes, put the pawns on the dark squares. Then the king comes in, and we see this king can march all the way in pretty much. This pawn can't come here to guard that square because the bishop would take b3. Okay, bishop. So white does a good thing. He tries to trade off the bishops. Now, of course, we don't want to trade that bishop because it's our main trump. Okay, the king is desperately trying to come over and defend. Now, c4 is a beautiful move. What it does is that it's another monkey wrench where it's a temporary pawn sacrifice, but the idea is that now this bishop can come over and pick this pawn up. This is a lesson that not all pawns are equal. Alright, so in the endgame, outside passed pawns are the most dangerous because it's very hard for the king to catch them. Okay, so black is willing to temporarily sacrifice this pawn, come over. There's nothing white can do to defend that pawn. Let's say he does something. Yeah, and the king will grab this pawn, bishop will grab that pawn, and then this pawn will run. Okay, it's only a temporary sacrifice. Monkey wrench. So what does he do? What happened in the game? Yep, he took. Bishop came here. It's exactly what happened in the game. Bishop came to d5 to desperately try and at least hold on to one pawn. Bishop takes this one, and now black. And here actually, back here, white actually resigned. Amazingly enough, he knew that black has won this endgame. But let's see what could have happened. Let's say we take the pawn. Now black has a threat of pushing this pawn here, and if white takes, we take the bishop. Remove the defender, right? Remove the c4 pawn. It's kind of overloaded. So the bishop had to run so that this move is not possible. But the problem is that if this bishop runs, then it stops guarding this pawn. So then black would come here and pick up this pawn. So you see the advantage in having all of your opponent's pawns on the color of your bishop, because you have so many targets to work with, and white's bishop is practically useless against these pawns, right? Alright guys, I'm just going to wrap up with a quick review here. A few things we learned. Create an open file for your rook to infiltrate down. Transformation of advantages. Sometimes you can't hold on to the same advantage, so it pays off to set up the next advantage, which was black put all of his pawns on the dark squares in anticipation of the bishop, same colored bishop endgame. And then the idea of the monkey wrench here. Well, here it's not even a sacrifice because the bishop is guarding, but often it pays to throw a pawn in the fire, kind of mess up your opponent's pawn structure, and then all these pawns will crumble, right? There's nothing he can do to defend these pawns. Okay, thanks guys. That was endgame lesson number 1. How do I stop this video?